Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Again, thank you for your patience. I appreciate your understanding as we work through the technological problem here with the laptop. Again, my name is Jim Brooks. I'm the Program Director for Community Development and Infrastructure, part of the staff at National League of Cities that helped put together the team of workshops over the course of today, focusing mostly on infrastructure. Obviously, there's a set of workshops on sustainability and finance economic development. So if you're in the infrastructure program, that's particularly the one we have here. I hope you liked last night's presentation. Ed Rendell obviously addressing some of the big national perspectives on infrastructure, a large perspective. You got to love a guy who calls us all wusses. And so that was a way to begin to look at this in an overarching fashion. But really this morning with our guest John Norquist, former mayor himself, we're going to bring this down to the real practical level, the level that mayors and council members and city managers deal with. You may know he served as mayor of Milwaukee for 16 years, and now he's the president and chief executive officer of the Congress for the New Urbanism. And so he's going to focus his attention on local practices and opportunities around the issues of land use and housing and transportation, economic prosperity, and the partnerships across cities and regions that make these things work. In his work at Congress for New Urbanism, he's taken all the skills he learned as a mayor about streetscapes and zoning and downtown living and job creation, and he's really championed a lot of the new thinking about how we live and how our communities grow and thrive. He's got some prepared remarks, the PowerPoint obviously that you'll see available. At the end we'll have some time for questions. As necessary, I can bring this microphone around to folks, so I ask you please put your hands together for one of your own peers, Mr. John Norquist.
Thank you. I really enjoyed being a local official, and it's a very important responsibility, and I wanted to talk about infrastructure today in the context of being a local official. When we hear about infrastructure from groups that make money off of building infrastructure, it's usually a pretty generalized plea. More infrastructure, and the Congress should appropriate more money. Sometimes they even are daring and boldly say raise taxes to raise more money, use the T word. But I think for local officials you should look at this a little differently. You should look at it selfishly from the standpoint of your own community. You should be for infrastructure that adds value to your community. That's absolutely fundamental. And not everything that comes out of the federal government and the state governments and the state DOTs or the EPA or all kinds of other organizations, not everything comes out of there calibrated to add value to your community. And so somebody needs to raise that point. And so I'm going to be touching on that this morning. I want to highlight, I have a slide with this on it, but we work with the Institute of Transportation Engineers, which is the group that represents traffic engineers, basically. They used to be called traffic engineers, now they're called transportation engineers. But we did this alternative manual, street guide, Designing Walkable Urban Thoroughfares, a Context-Sensitive Approach. And our organization, the CAU, which has about 2,500 members who are mostly architects and planners, but also developers, local officials, various other people from various occupations. We balloted it, and almost all of our members voted for it, which you'd expect. We're kind of a pro-environmental group. But the traffic engineers balloted it, and over 92% of them voted in favor of this. And what it is, basically, is written for engineers and planners, but also local officials. At least the opening couple of pages are, which I wrote myself. That's for the local officials. It's actually in English. But this book is available you can buy a hard copy of it, or you can download it for nothing at ite.org. And it's intended to have street investments add value to the local communities. When you're in the urban or suburban context, or even small town context, you can use this book. You don't have to use Ashto's Green Book. You don't have to make the only purpose of the street moving vehicles. It can also be, the purpose of the street can be adding value to your community. So let's talk about streets, although I'm also going to refer to zoning. Streets traditionally throughout human history, going back thousands of years, once they get into a city, they're meant to have three purposes. Movement of goods and services and people is one purpose, but also as a marketplace, usually the main street through a community will be the market street, and also a social purpose, Main Street, the gathering place, the town square. And if you look at our national transportation program, it tends to ignore the last two purposes. Anyway, the other thing I wanted you to see on this slide is the effect of separate use zoning, which is encouraged by federal agencies, particularly Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, FHA. It almost mandates it. In order to get into the secondary mortgage market, residential property cannot be attached to more than 20% non-residential in terms of imputed value, and that has the effect of reinforcing separate use zoning. So if you want mixed use zoning, which a lot of the upcoming generations, the millennials, the Gen Xers and all that, they have a preference for that in the real estate market. The federal regulations and guidelines tend to block that, and I'll talk more about that later. So what does work in a city? And you can see it in Chicago, which is a big city that nobody has to feel sorry for. It's been very successful in the post-war period, unlike a lot of other cities. More successful in Milwaukee, I have to admit, although we've had our moments of success. But Wicker Park is a neighborhood in Chicago, and it has a number of lessons that are important to learn. This is the main intersection. North Avenue, Milwaukee Avenue, and Damon Avenue come together. There's a blue line stop there that helps the neighborhood out. But anyway, what I want you to see here is that the streets, they're all one moving lane in each direction. They carry about 30,000 cars a day, and they have on-street parking all day at rush hour, especially at rush hour, because the retailers want to sell stuff. And if the retailers sell stuff, then the buildings are worth more money. And then the city can tax the buildings and have enough money to pay all these whining public employees that are demanding more and more money all the time. And so the street works in the interests of the city, not just in moving vehicles. It is congested. This is off-peak hour, so it doesn't look that congested. I'll show you a congested street. This is Dundas Street in Toronto, which has a streetcar line with a running in each direction, and the motor vehicles share that lane in each direction with it. At rush hour, there's no restriction on parking. And this is a major street in Toronto. And people ride the streetcar even though it's going through this congestion. Now, why do they do that? Because congestion isn't all bad. I mean, think about it. You know, it's a little bit like cholesterol. There's good congestion and bad congestion. Good cholesterol, bad cholesterol. And so the congestion here is not just a question of vehicle congestion. It's, for the retailers, it looks like customer congestion because their restaurants and businesses are full. And to people that own the buildings, they have tenant congestion. They don't have empty buildings. So they put up with a little bit of traffic congestion. It's like Yogi Berra said, you know, people don't go there anymore. It's too crowded. But if you left it, if you just took the pure version of the Ashto Green Book and applied it to Toronto, you'd have to tear down all the buildings on one side of the street, widen the street, and you would solve their congestion problem. And that's what happens when national or state standards are applied to a local situation. And that's why your job as a local official. Now, you may want a street that's, you know, free-flowing traffic, and, you know, you think that you need that in order to service whatever you need to service, and that adds value to your community. Then do it. But think about it. Does it add value to your community? This is the typical American Main Street. if you went to civil engineering class back in the 1920s at Purdue or Nebraska or anywhere, you would have learned this street. This is the two-rod street, 2 rods from the center lane to the building line, 8-foot sidewalks, 50 feet of pavement, retail on the first floor, housing above, low-cost housing that was created before the federal government had any federal housing agencies whatsoever. And this was a form that worked. It still works. If you go all over the United States, from coast to coast, you can find streets that were built in the late 19th century or the first half of the 20th century, and they'll almost inevitably be 50 feet of pavement, 8-foot sidewalks. Sometimes it varies a little less sidewalk, a little more street, whatever. But it'll be that 2-rod form, and that's what they learn. They don't learn that anymore. But it really worked well. I mean, like for deliveries, there's just enough room to double park so the truck can unload the donuts and the vehicles can still get by. And so it was valuable, and it served that traditional 3 purposes: market, social, and movement. The people still get there. And there's Lodi, Wisconsin, little Lodi, Wisconsin. The other picture was in Milwaukee, which is a nice little town, and it has the 2-rod streets. This is what they learn now. 72-foot, this is the standard one you're going to get if nobody interferes at all in the process. This is what the DOTs will recommend or whatever. 72 feet of pavement, 20-foot interchange so you can have a double left turn lane at the intersection, 100-foot clear zone on each side because that's supposed to make it safer. Actually, all it does is make people drive faster and you get more fatal accidents. But anyway, after spending all that money and buying up all that land, they don't have enough money left to build a sidewalk, so you get the dirt path that the illegal immigrants walk on. Well, no, that people that want to walk. I mean, there actually are law-abiding Americans, even American veterans like me. I was in the Army. I like to walk. Anyway, or you can walk in the gutter. You know, that's another alternative. You know, so the Americans have a love affair with the automobile. Well, you can either be a criminal suspect in the gutter, or you can be in one of those vehicles and be a real American. I mean, that's sort of the way that it's framed for people in their minds. I mean, particularly when I rode around with police officers, sometimes pedestrians on streets like this, they would automatically assume something that was usually not the case. Another issue that intervenes in this, and it's not just federal stuff, it's specialists. And your fire marshals know a lot, and their knowledge needs to be respected, but sometimes things need to be discussed a little bit more. And one of their ideas is the 20-foot clear rule on streets. That's expensive. It costs developers a lot of money to do that. You end up with, if you have parking on each side and 20-foot clear, you're going to have a 36-foot residential street. That doesn't work very well. That's one of the reasons developers come around begging for subsidy and not wanting to pay their impact fees and things like that. Actually, fire trucks don't need to pass each other at high speed that often. It really doesn't make, and a lot more firefighters die in vehicle accidents because they're driving too fast than because they're on a narrow street. And another thing that happens with this, in the city of Charlotte, and you can go to the City of Charlotte website, or you can go to our website, cnu.org, and we have a little section on this that you can find and download their study, shows that they're able to serve almost twice as many people when they have a connected street grid instead of having cul-de-sacs and giant roads. And so we've been trying to engage with the firefighters, with the ICC, the International Code Council, and other groups. But this is a real problem because they're forcing us into having much bigger streets than we would normally have. And if you go out and measure and see how much room they actually need, 10-foot or 12-foot clear would be enough. The other thing is that a lot of people get killed because vehicles are going too fast. And so if you have fire trucks racing along at 45, 50, 60 miles an hour in cities, You can end up with pedestrian injuries. Anything over 40 miles an hour is going to be death in an encounter between a vehicle. And it's not just the fire trucks, I mean just vehicles generally. If you overbuild the size of your streets, you're going to end up with a lot more fatalities. I mentioned the EPA briefly because, and the EPA has given us much cleaner air. They do a marvelous job. I'm not against the EPA. I'm not for cutting their budget. But when they deal with things like ditches, and they come along and start treating ditches alongside roads as wetlands to protect, that has implications that are pretty serious. If you started from scratch in this country and had that rule, you couldn't have built a city. You couldn't build Main Street. You couldn't put in curb and gutter. And so we've been engaging, along with some other groups, with EPA on their new stormwater rules so that they don't count ditches next to roads as precious things that need to be saved no matter what. Because there's environmental benefits that come from cities and come from urban form and main streets that are more effective than saving every ditch by every road. And so they need to look at things more broadly. And fortunately, it seems like they are listening. We'll see when their rules come out pretty soon. And stuff like this. This is one where I agree with the fire marshal. You don't want a fire truck ending up in this thing stuck. You know, I mean, I think, you know, dealing with creative ways to do drainage, experimenting with it is a good idea. But when the drainage expert dominates all the thinking, and if you're against doing anything like this, you're suddenly anti-environmental, that's not fair. And so I want you to know that it's okay if you're a local official to raise an issue and say, well, maybe this wouldn't work if you look at the bigger picture and the broader issue. Maybe there's a different way to solve the drainage problem other than creating a corner that can become a problem. All right, now I'm going to talk a little bit about Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Now, conservatives tend to blame Fannie Mae and Acorn. Those are the two reasons that we had a recession, Fannie Mae and Acorn, the rhetoric around it. And I am a Democrat. I actually usually almost always, well, vote Democratic. But and so I love FDR and all that kind of stuff. But I, as an urbanist, as somebody that cares about cities, I have a big problem with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and FHA and 221D4, the capital program for multiple family housing, and 220, the other multiple family capital program, because they're all set up with a lot of anti-urban criteria. This stuff passed in 1934, and it was the Better Housing Program. It was loaded with all kinds of bad stuff that didn't have much impact for the first 20 or 30 years, but is having a horrible impact now, especially now that almost all the secondary mortgage market is funded by Treasury and FHA. And so all their rules are being enforced now. And one of those rules is you can't have any more than 20% non-residential. I'll mention one other rule that was really disgusting that was repealed in 1949. But in 1934, FHA, when it started up, required racial segregation covenants. You had to have segregation in order to have a subdivision eligible for FHA financing. And that was repealed under Truman in 49 and finally made illegal in 1962. But Levittown, in 1960 census, with over 60,000 people living in Levittown, just outside of New York City, 0 African Americans. That was the effect of that rule. I mean, complete segregation. So when you think about FHA and Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, they're not some perfectly designed liberal plot from a liberal standpoint. They actually are loaded with all kinds of toxic stuff. And some of it's been removed, but some of it hasn't. And the impact of the not allowing mixed use into the mortgage market directly affects you and your cities. If you want to have a main street with stores on the first floor, you know, with the coffee shop and Dottie's coffee shop and then a couple apartments on top, that is really, really severely discouraged, almost impossible to do with all these mortgage rules, And the result of that, you could see it after World War II. So this is Northland Shopping Center just outside Detroit, which the first really big separate use retail. And this happened all over the country, and that's what really forced the creation of the malls. And this became illegal. Main Street. This is actually Brady Street in the Italian neighborhood in Milwaukee. Retail on the first floor, apartments above. And the apartments above are where people can live who don't want to have a big yard, or they're maybe too old or too young to take care of a big yard. They want to live in this kind of condition. And it's cheaper, or at least it used to be when you could finance it. When my grandfather was a carpenter, and he had a carpentry shop on Payne Avenue. This is the east side of St. Paul, Payne Avenue. Carpentry shop, 2 apartments above. After World War II, my Uncle Earl, who's a plumber, bought it. When he got his bank financing, the banker, because things hadn't really come into play yet, the banker said, oh, you got two apartments above, that's great, because then if you have a bad year in plumbing contracting, you can still get the rent, and vice versa. So diversification was a good thing. It's not a good thing anymore because of these rules that make it so hard to mix uses. And that affects local urban development. How's it? Another way it affects you is when you have these kinds of interferences in the market, then the developers all come crawling to you guys, begging you for cash, talking about public-private partnerships, which is their private hand reaching into the public treasury. That's the public-private partnership. And the stuff that was done before all these rules were created, like this is Oak Park in Chicago, that was Frank Lloyd Wright's hometown, and it's got the retail above. It's very successful wherever you see it. But Fannie Mae doesn't like that stuff. This is their headquarters in D.C., and FHA, home ownership. They want everybody to have, they're used to want everybody to be a homeowner. And this is HUD. This is where you go if you want to get an exception to the rule so you can have a Main Street. So for our developers that want to build a Main Street, this is what it really looks like to them. That's what regulatory process. So you get to where has Main Street been built since World War II? And really only in 2 places. This is in Orlando, and the other one's in Disneyland. You know, they have the retail on the first floor with Mickey and Minnie living above. And mixed use you can get in the hyper-dense environment of Manhattan. It's not a problem. You build a 35, 40, 60-story apartment building, 1 or 2 or even 3 floors of retail aren't going to screw up the thing. Or you can do a Frank Gehry, some weird thing with giant buildings everywhere. That was eligible for FHA right away. The design still didn't make it, even with all the subsidy it got, and they had to change it. But Brooklyn can't make it. This is Flatbush Avenue. Retail on the first floor, apartments above, doesn't make it into the Fannie or Freddie secondary mortgage market. It's discriminated against the market. I mean, the banks don't like it because it's not eligible for FHA. And so you end up all of this stuff getting hurt. One of the reasons we had slums was because this stuff couldn't get financed. And now I want to just quickly turn to things that you control yourselves. You should check your own codes, and you should check your own street metrics that are in your city plan and all that. Because when I got elected to office in '88, this laundromat was built on National Avenue, which is a major arterial, and it was set back 30 feet. The developer, who was somebody I knew, I said, Mac, what the hell? Why did you build that 30 feet back? It looks like a broken tooth. We've got this beautiful street. It's all set back. And he says, well, Norquist, it's your code that made me do it. I had no choice. Oh, okay. So we changed the code. We made the code so if you want to build up to the street, you get your permits almost instantly. You want a setback? You can get one maybe if you wait about 15 years. We might think about it. I mean, you want to do the right thing, and we recoded all the streets so that it did what we want. And the neighborhoods like it too. They understand that issue. It took a while to explain it, but they understand it. Where does this other stuff come from? You know, we tend to think of the big highways and big roadways and freeways as the American way. You know, get the flag flying. Corbusier, he was a socialist. Here's the template. 1922, that's the drawing for the freeway. That's his city of tomorrow with high-rise buildings. And it was built in Crystal City, right near the Reagan Airport. You can't walk on that road. I took that picture illegally, but the statute of limitations has run out. No problem there. And the other guy who really loved these giant roads with grade separation, Oscar Niemeyer, he's a communist. He's still alive. He's 103 years old. And he did Brasilia, where all the streets are grade separated. That's the role of the pedestrian. Can you imagine that? You have to go outside Brasilia to find an interesting neighborhood or restaurant, and people don't want to live in that city because it's a great place to drive fast. There's not traffic obstacles, but it's not a city anymore. And that kind of infrastructure, the philosophy behind that kind of stuff, when that's imposed on your city, you should ask a question. If you're from Missouri, ask the Missouri DOT if they really think it's that important. And you can see the impacts. This is Claiborne Avenue in New Orleans back in 1947. And in 1966, they decided to solve their traffic congestion problem. So this street had 2,000 live oaks on a 3-mile stretch of boulevard, Claiborne Avenue, and they just started ripping it apart. And they put up the freeway. And right now, the mayor and the alderman from the area and a lot of other people in the Tremé neighborhood, they want to put it back. Detroit's another city that was infected by this. The most successful city in World War II, produced more war material for the British Army, our Army, even the Red Army, all this stuff that defeated the Nazis and the Japanese, the most successful city. This is the way it looked in the spring of '46 when my parents had their honeymoon there. Woodward Avenue, 3 department stores, Kearns Crowley's, Hudson's, the second largest one in America, streetcars, sidewalks packed with pedestrians, congestion. They had a congestion problem. And so they went out of their way to solve it. And they built freeways, widened the streets. There's Hudson's going down 30 years later. This is Berlin, 1945. They lost the war. Remember that? The Nazis lost. Over 60% of the city's buildings were destroyed. And then they had a wall running through the middle of it. This is the intersection where the wall used to be, Potsdamer Platz. And it's completely successful. Everything's built back. There's no war damage. Even back when the communists were in the East, they repaired a lot of the war damage. Kind of junky repair, but they did it. And in Detroit, you sit there with over 35% of the land vacant that had buildings on it in 1960. There's a lot of reasons for it, but one of the reasons was they took out their 300-mile streetcar system, widened all the roads, and you end up with a city that it was the most successful city in World War II. Now it looks like that's where World War II happened. But it's changing. You've got the economics of these things don't work that well. They work well in the countryside where the land is cheap, but in the city they don't work so well. So the West Side Highway went down in New York in '75. It fell down, and it's just been replaced by a normal street. And the real estate values went right through the roof. People could walk over to the Hudson River and see it out their window again. And they didn't put in a fancy street. It's just a 6-lane arterial with a bike trail next to it. The Embarcadero Freeway was knocked down and replaced with the boulevard. They just put it back the way it was before, and that worked. And the South Central Artery in San Francisco is now the Octavia Boulevard. And in Milwaukee, we replaced this freeway. And the most dramatic of all, in Seoul, South Korea, it was built right after after the Korean War. We actually paid for this road. And it was taken out, replaced with 2 moving lanes on each side of the river. It's sort of like the Chicago River is, with Wacker Drive next to it. They didn't try to replace the capacity, the richness of the street grid, handle the traffic, and there's the mayor, Lee Myung-bak, who's now the president of South Korea. Look how happy he is. He stood up to the traffic planners in the national South Korean government and said, whatever's here has got to add value to Seoul. And so we're not doing it your way. He got elected in 01. They made the decision by 03. Everything was built by 07. I mentioned water before, but water engineers really get it more and more now. They value wetlands. They understand the complexity of the wetland is a good thing, that you don't need to drain them all. You don't need to put something else. You don't need to pave them. It still happens once in a while. Somebody has an idea to do it, and it still happens. But the engineers know better. They've learned. And the traffic engineers are starting, at ITE and other places, they're starting to understand that the street grid, see that stuff in the upper left-hand corner? That's the local roads. That's the stuff where all your tax base is. They haven't cared about that. That hasn't been their responsibility. It's a state highway. Your street is a state highway. It must meet our standard. And so they build one of these roads that's really hard to develop property on or for people to walk along. They haven't understood that, but they're starting to understand it. The street grid of Washington, D.C., with all of its boulevards and it's the complexity of it all, it really works. Like at rush hour, Connecticut Avenue goes 8 to 13 miles an hour at peak rush hour, peak half hour. The Potomac Freeway is going 2 to 6 miles an hour at peak half hour. So, you know, the boulevard actually works pretty well. In the middle of the night at 2 a.m., Potomac Freeway is much faster. But when you need it the most, it comes down to almost nothing. And so the urban form, the complexity of the city, like the wetland for water, it absorbs congestion. The wetland absorbs flooding. See the analogy? Anyway, okay. And here's Madison, Wisconsin, a much smaller place. They have two big employers here. Well, maybe a little smaller recently. The state government and the university. And they get through this rush hour no problem. They don't have any big roads. They have a couple boulevards, but that's it. People make themselves. One street's a little crowded. Oh, tomorrow I'm going to go on another one, the next one over. And they somehow get through there without the whole thing. And so it's a very marvelous place. But you can see what happened in Detroit. They had the Gratiot plan in the downtown. They had the Woodward plan, which is almost good or maybe even better than the Burnham plan in Chicago. And they put all these rural type roads in there. And they come down to, you can see at the bottom of the picture, that's where the Detroit River is. And they have these things knifing like pincers coming in on the tunnel that goes over to Windsor. Windsor doesn't have any of that stuff. They just have their grid. They don't have empty lots. They have a couple maybe. But almost all the buildings are there. The place is vibrant. You go to Detroit, they solve their traffic. Congestion is not a big problem in Detroit. The other thing to watch out for is the grid. You know, I said it's easier to serve with emergency vehicles and all that when you have a grid. It also is better for property values. We gradually changed it. Nothing wrong with a curvilinear grid. You can have some curvy streets, no problem. It's still connected. But then when they started not connecting it, and now almost automatically the developer wants to do the cul-de-sac. Now it's not just because developers have bad taste. Sure, a lot of them do. But it's because they can't afford to build these 36-foot wide streets. And so that's one of the reasons we've got to get the street widths under control for residential. You should be able to do a 24, 26, 28-foot wide street, and it's going to save enough money. Maybe the developers won't feel they have to build the cul-de-sacs. And you can see how it works. Like the city of Elgin, they have this old grid left over from the 19th century. It's doing great. West of town, they've got a lot of empty land they annexed. They were going to build it with 1,200-foot-long blocks. Well, if you have 1,200-foot-long blocks, you're not going to have very many intersections, and people aren't going to walk, and you're going to end up with cul-de-sacs, which they were encouraging at that time. They've changed it now. They've got it down to 500-foot-long blocks with a lot of connectivity because they want to add value, because they think that that'll add more value to their community. Maybe you won't. Maybe you think it won't. Maybe something else will add more value. But ask yourself that question. What does add the most value? And that's why you should check this book out. And the book is calibrated to the transect so that, you know, it's, when you're in a giant city like Chicago, it's a little different than when you're in a smaller place like Cedar Rapids, Iowa or something. And you can use techniques like, this is a thing in Elgin where, because they didn't allow left turns on this road, which is Lake Street until it gets to Elgin. It's just Lake Street coming out of Chicago. Lake Street in Chicago's 50 feet wide, where you've got millions and millions of people in downtown Chicago. It's 50 feet wide. It gets out to Elgin, it's, you know, 86 feet wide, and grade separated in a lot of places. And here, no left turn lanes. You've got a shopping center that was dying because nobody could turn left. Look at, that's the route you had to go through if you're turning left. You have to go up the intersection, go down a block, come back around just to go to that shopping center, which couldn't lease tenants and couldn't pay taxes if there's no tenants. So they changed the plan. So they're going to put in blocks and streets, and then the retail will get stronger. And if Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac weren't interfering in it, they could also put housing above it so grandma could live on a street and go down, walk a couple buildings over, and get a cup of coffee in the morning. These big streets can be retrofitted. If you're from a suburb that has a lot of big, nasty streets and you don't know what to do about it, there are ways to deal with it. You can put in a boulevard. You can redevelop it so that it's a walkable street. A lot of people can do that now. And it's happening more and more. Additions to the grid. This is Savannah, Georgia. And for years, they felt like they couldn't do anything. James Oglethorpe's plan in the middle of Savannah is worth a fortune, millions of dollars. People love living there. It's a great source of tax revenue for the city, but the city's doing giant roads and cul-de-sacs. You know, why? And then you go out there and it's all junk. It's not going to last. You know, get a big box that gets torn down 10 years later. So they actually added the exact dimensions, just a little bit downriver from downtown, adjacent to where the Oglethorpe plant is. They added to it. And, you know, some of the historic preservationists grumbled, yeah, but that wasn't Oglethorpe doing it. We're doing it today. Is that okay to do that? Yeah. Yeah, you can still build good stuff today. You just follow the plan, get the dimensions right. And there it is. And it's all built now. There's a lot of buildings on it now. I need to update that picture. Very popular real estate. Now, another thing I wanted to get in here is that big boxes are not necessarily the enemy. If you ask them to do what you want, sometimes they'll do it. And in the case of Chicago, they got a Home Depot built on the street with metered parking. The parking to get to their lot, you have to go in the alley and come in under the store. It has escalators, 2 stories. It could be a Nordstrom's if you took the Home Depot off of it. That's what Home Depot was willing to do. Now, in a smaller town, they might not be willing to go that far, but they will do stuff. Walmart in Milwaukee. This is an African-American, relatively low-income neighborhood, middle class and low-income mixed together. There was a mall that died, an interior-facing mall was scraped. The developer, the company he could get to come in and be the anchor was Walmart. They came in, they built it on a street with a sidewalk in front of it. There's actually a building about to go up in between that building and the Foot Locker where Walmart will actually be touching another building. And they cut their parking ratios way down. They didn't care. They don't care about parking ratios as much as they used to. They don't care about they don't need to have a design with a sea of parking and a box in the middle anymore. They're willing to be more urban. They've concentrated all of their negative energy on one thing: unions. Now, if that's not your issue, I mean, I have nothing against unions, but, you know, as long as you're not fighting them because it's the union thing, they'll build an urban store, just like Whole Foods, which has no union stores at all. They're in San Francisco, New York, they're in all the union places because their stores look good and they fit in the neighborhood. And now Walmart finally figured that out. Whole Foods gets to go everywhere and they get blocked everywhere. And another thing is when you commit municipal, okay, how much time we got? 1 minute? Okay. All right. Okay, but when you have parking regulations that destroy your tax base, in this case we had 7 parking spots on a 19-foot frontage. And this is my last two slides. We have our annual meeting coming up in May in in West Palm Beach, and Jan Gell will be there, the planner from Denver, and Richard, Florida. And you're all welcome to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. We have some time. I do want to have the opportunity to take questions, so I'm actually going to come around with the microphone to folks if we have a couple of questions before our time is up. Do I see some hands for anyone? Well, yeah.
You just barely touched on, and thank you. I really appreciate that presentation. It was interesting perspective. And strangely coming from a Democrat, that amazed me. Well, you touched on sort of a criticism of cul-de-sacs, but you did not explain that criticism. Would you like to take a minute and explain that?
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, one criticism of cul-de-sacs is that the emergency vehicles can't go where they need to go, so they have to go out of their way and come back to get where they need to go. The other thing that happens with cul-de-sacs is it makes it much less likely that people will walk. If they have to walk a direction different than where they want to go, it becomes very difficult for them to do it. And it also tends to lead to a very steep hierarchy of roads. So you go right from cul-de-sac to giant arterial. And the giant arterials really, once you get up to 70, 80 feet, it becomes very difficult to walk across those streets. So the connectivity has a lot of value for municipal services because you don't have to drive as far to get started, including like garbage collection or whatever other municipal services you have. And it makes for better neighborhoods, more community.
Hi, I'm Pam Dobrovolsky from Wayne, Michigan. And our city, before I even got on council, they have Michigan Avenue going through it. And what happened is the state came through, and through urban development, they split our city, where Michigan Avenue East is going on one side, and then Michigan Avenue West goes right down the middle of our city. So therefore, that kind of destroyed our whole town, our downtown. Is there any way that you can reverse that through the state and say, hey, we don't want this anymore?
Yeah, you could. I mean, if you're talking about something that has any structure to it that gets in the air, it eventually will, it has about a 40-year life, so when the 40 years runs out, you can, try to replace it. It's cheaper to be on the surface than be in the air, so actually changing it might be cheaper than leaving it the way it is and repairing it. If you're just talking about a wide street, a big arterial, there are ways that you can put a median in the middle and cut down the capacity a little bit. The lane widths. In Vancouver, BC now, they passed an ordinance that no traffic lane on any arterial in Vancouver can be bigger than 3 meters. That's 9 feet 10 inches. And they did it for safety reasons, because if the road reads narrow, then people drive a little more carefully and slowly. So they did that on purpose. And the Michigan DOT has a little bit of a little coven of reformers that talked whisper in the hallways and so forth. And I think eventually one of them, there's a guy named James Schultz. I'm probably getting him in trouble. If he gets fired, tell him not to expect any compensation from me. But he's sort of the leader of some of those guys. He's a traffic engineer at Michigan DOT, so you could look him up. Yeah.
I just want to say thank you. Several years ago, our mayor and a number of council members from Normal, Illinois, caught the idea of the new urbanism, and we were at the brink of redoing our uptown area.
Chris Coos.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes. And as a result, part of our redesign work included a very tiny roundabout right centered in the middle of this uptown area with a water feature around it and a little grassy knoll for people to sit on and benches to eat ice cream. It just won the first place in the 100 best public spaces in the United States. So thank you. I think you had a part in that.
Yeah.
Yeah, look for that, folks.
Yeah, one of our board members did the design, Doug Farr.
I'm going to give one last question back here, and then we'll conclude.
Arnold Weinfeld with the Michigan Municipal League. Good to see you again, John. John, we just had an issue come up in a community in Michigan where MDOT, at the heeding of a local politician, decided to raise the speed limit on a road in East Lansing because it was a speed trap. And unfortunately, the MDOT engineer who agreed with the decision actually said that sometimes faster is safer. So we could actually use as much information as you have available on how speed kills and creates additional fatalities.
Yeah, it's all in here.
Obviously, we still have some issues within the Michigan DOT and certainly our policymakers. So as much as we can continue to work with local officials on convincing state engineers and directors of DOT that congestion is a good thing and speed kills, we could use your help.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a shocking thing to a traffic engineer to start the conversation by saying congestion is good. You might want to try a few other things like, hello, how are you doing, before you get to that point. But definitely speed faster is not safer under almost any condition. But, you know, you make a compromise. I mean, we do want to get where we want to go in a reasonable time. So, you know, some roads, you know, big highways have to have higher speed limits. But there definitely is a correlation between higher speed and death. I think that the way to approach this stuff is to engage. Traffic engineers tend to be fairly ignored and lonely, desperately lonely, and they can use company. And I think it's a good idea to talk to them, invite them. In your local government, your traffic planner, your engineer, your city engineer, spend time with them. Don't leave them alone where they just don't think in this orthodox way that they have in the past. Anyway, and always ask the question, what adds value to my community? And that'll lead you in the right direction. By the way, if any of you are interested, I wrote a book called The Wealth of Cities, and it has all my great ideas in it. So if anybody wants one, I'll sell it to you for a reasonable price after the meeting. Thank you very much.
Let's give one final thanks to John Norquist for his presentation this morning.